The earliest civilization began at the meeting point of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. There, the Sumerian civilization began around 3200 BC. When we talk about civilization, we are referring to a group of villages or towns that developed and established some form of government that extended beyond the family units. In addition, these civilizations, as they developed, were able to sustain levels of farming beyond mere subsistence farming that allowed the development of artisans, priests, and warriors. Soon after the Sumerian civilization developed, a similar civilization developed along the Nile River in Egypt. The Egyptian civilizations, which arose around 3000 BC, would go through various dynasties and kingdoms, but it was one of the longest lasting in history, spanning 1500 years. In 2900 BC, the Great Pyramids that are still standing today were built. At the same time, in another river valley, the Indus in India, the Indian civilization rose. 200 years later, around 2900 BC, the first Minoan civilization began on the Greek island of Crete. In 2340, Sargon became the king of Akkad. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, in the Yellow River Valley, the Chinese civilization was beginning. From 2205 to 1767, the Xia dynasty ruled China. In 2000 BC, the great stone palaces of Knossos were built. At the same time, the Babylonians were developing an advanced mathematics system. In 1792 BC, Hammurabi completed his conquest of Mesopotamia and issued the famous code that bears his name. In 1595, the Babylonian era ended when the Hittites laid waste to Babylonia. 95 years later, the Harappan civilization of India was taken over by the Aryans, an immigrant group that seems to have migrated from the West. 50 years later, in 1450, the Minoan civilization came to an end when the Greeks laid waste to it. In 1240, a people that was destined to have an effect on the world, in ways in excess to their numbers, the Israelites, settled in what had been Canaan. They were the first people to believe in monotheism, one God, and their belief became the central tenet of Judaism, which itself gave birth to Christianity and Islam. Half a world apart in China, the Shang dynasty ended in 1027. In 995, the golden age of the Israelite kingdom began when King David, who had replaced King Saul, who died in battle, captured Jerusalem, which he made his capital, and extended his kingdom to cover many neighboring lands. His son, King Solomon, built the temple in Jerusalem. In 814 BC, Carthage was founded by Phoenician traders. From 780 onward, Greece, which had limited arable land, responded to the needs of a growing population by settling colonies in Asia Minor. These colonies would soon provide a point of friction between Greece and the powers of Asia. In 753, Rome was founded. From 736 to 716, the Spartans, who solved their population problems by subjugating their neighbors, fought a difficult war with the Mycenaeans. In order to better fight this war, the Spartans organized their city-state along a warlike structure. At the same time the Spartans were fighting the Mycenaean War, the kingdom of Israel, which had split from the kingdom of Judea after the death of Solomon, fell to the Assyrians. Its population was scattered, and thus began the legend of the 10 lost tribes. In 660 BC, on the other side of the world, the Empire of Japan was established. In 621, the Greek lawgiver Draco issued his laws. While harsh, they were the beginning of the rule of laws that would define Athenian democracy. 9 years later, in 612 BC, the Assyrian Empire ended with the fall of Nineveh. In 588, the first kingdom of Judea ended when Nebuchadnezzar captured Jerusalem. 559 BC saw the rise of Cyrus the Great to a newly established Persian crown. He extended Persian dominance to include Egypt. He also allowed many of the peoples subjected by the Babylonians new freedoms. Thus the Jews were allowed to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. Darius extended the Persian rule in 516 BC to include India. In 509 BC, the Roman Republic was founded. The next year saw Cleisthenes establishing true democracy in Athens. The expanding Persian Empire took control of the Greek colonies in Asia Minor, who revolted in 499 BC. This led to a Persian War with the Greeks. In Persia's two attempts, they were unable to defeat the Greeks, who had united to fight off the Persian threat. Greek unity was short-lived, however, and from 431 to 404, the Greeks fought between themselves, with Athens and Sparta being the main protagonists in the Peloponnesian Wars that ended in the defeat of Athens in 404 BC. The Athenian defeat did not end the wars between the Greek states, and their constant fighting left them vulnerable to be conquered by their northern neighbors, the Macedons. In 346, Philip of Macedon completed his conquest of Greece. With his death at the hands of an assassin, Alexander the Great, his son, took the reins of power. In a series of battles, Alexander conquered the Persian Empire and took control of all the lands between Greece and India. With Alexander's death, his vast dominion was broken in three. In 321, in India, the Hindu Mauryan dynasty came to power. Meanwhile, to the west of Greece, Rome was solidifying its control over the Italian peninsula. Its growing power soon brought it into conflict with Carthage. It fought three wars known as the Punic Wars. The first from 265 to 241. During the Second Punic War, the Carthaginian general Hannibal brought his troops, including elephants, over the Alps into Italy. Carthage, however, was unable to resist growing Roman power and was destroyed in the Third Punic War that ended in 149 BC. Meanwhile, the Jews of Judea, who had been living under Hellenist rule, revolted in 160 BC under the command of Judas the Maccabee, creating the story of Hanukkah. Rome's success on the battlefield in the Punic War and in subsequent battles that were quickly expanding the frontiers of the Roman Empire did not bring peace and well-being to Rome itself. Instead, it led to a period of instability and civil wars. The Romans, who were probably the ancient world's largest slaveholders, were forced to fight three wars instigated by slave revolts. In 60 BC, Rome's three great generals, Pompey, Crassus, and Julius Caesar, effectively ended the Roman Republic and created the first triumvirate to rule Rome. Peace did not ensue, and after invading England, Caesar returned to Rome with his armies and seized power. Caesar successfully defeated his rivals for power, only to be assassinated in 44 BC. After another period of internal strife, Octavian became the first Roman emperor in 27 BC. In Judea at this time, Herod the Great was making his physical mark on the land, building his temple and cities like Caesarea. Around 0 AD, in Judea, a man was born whose religious teaching would eventually transform the world, Jesus of Nazareth. His execution by the Romans by crucifixion would lead to the rise of Christianity. In 25 AD, the Han Dynasty began in China. In Rome, it was a period of turmoil. Emperors came and went. It was the time when Rome is said to have burned while Nero fiddled. In 1 year, there were 4 emperors in Rome. In 66 AD, the Jews of Judea revolted against Roman rule. They initially met with success, but in 70 AD, the Romans reconquered Jerusalem, and 3 years later, the final Jewish outpost, the fortress of Masada, fell. In 78, a new dynasty was established in India, the Kushans. In 96 AD, the first of 5 good emperors began his rule of Rome, bringing stability to Rome for nearly 100 years. In 167 AD, German tribes invaded northern Italy. The Roman Empire was able to repulse them this time. However, it was a sign of things to come. In 235, The Roman legion along the Rhine revolted and effectively began Rome's decline. That decline was reversed for a short time by Constantine the Great, who established his capital in Constantinople. Meanwhile, half a world away, the Tartars broke through the Great Wall of China. The barbarians, as they were known on the north, were ascendant. The Romans were forced in 407 to withdraw from England. 3 years later, in 410, Rome was sacked by the Visigoths. In 455, the Vandals sacked it. And in 476, the Western Roman Empire came to an end. The Eastern Roman Empire would continue for over 600 more years. In 565, under Emperor Justinian, the Byzantine Empire, whose religion had become Christianity, reached its height of development. In the 7th century, in 622, Mohammed, after claiming to have had visions from God, was forced to flee Mecca. He returned at the head of an army of followers. These followers, after his death, went on to conquer most of the Middle East, defeating the Persian Empire and conquering Egypt and much of North Africa. They went on to conquer Spain. Arab conquest was halted in the east when they failed to capture Constantinople in 673, and in the west at the Battle of Tours in southern France, where they were defeated. In 771, Charlemagne came to power in France. He expanded his control to include all of Germany. He maintained close ties to the Pope and was crowned Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas Day, 800. Charlemagne's empire could not outlast his death. In 851, the Danish Vikings sacked London, while other Vikings, led by Rurik, founded Russia. In 935, the Koryo dynasty was founded in Korea. It would remain in power until the 14th century. In 955, Otto the Great of Germany defeated the Magyars. In 962, he was named Holy Roman Emperor, thus for a short time strengthening the power of the empire. In 1031, the Umayyad Caliphate of Spain dissolved. This marked the beginning of the decline of Islamic power in Spain. Little by little, Spain was reconquered over the next 400 years by Christians. In 1095, the rise of Seljuk Turks resulted in a call by the Byzantine emperor for help from his Christian brethren in the west. Pope Urban responded by an appeal to begin a crusade to liberate Christian holy sites from Muslim control, and thus began a series of crusades whose barbarity has hardly been matched. Noblemen from throughout Europe responded, creating a force that was able to capture Jerusalem. Along the way, thousands of Jews and other non-Christians were slaughtered in a trail that began in Germany and ended in Jerusalem. In 1187, Saladin recaptured Jerusalem, and no other crusades were able to gain control of Jerusalem by force of arms. In 1229, Frederick II managed to negotiate control of Jerusalem that was to last for 10 years. In the meantime, in the east, Genghis Khan came to power in 1206. He and his Mongolian successors were able to create an empire that would include most of China, much of the Middle East, and most of Eastern Europe. By this time, in Europe, a number of distinct nation-states had developed, England and France being the most important. Italy was dominated by a number of independent city-states, Genoa, Pisa, and Venice, each of which constantly quarreled with each other. In 1271, Marco Polo, the Venetian explorer, set off with his father for China. After his return to Europe 12 years later, he kindled an immense interest in the Orient and Oriental products. In 1281, a massive Chinese attack on Japan failed when a mighty storm destroyed the Chinese fleet. The 14th century was a very difficult one for Western Europe. First, in 1337, a war that was to last 100 years began between England and France. The war dominated European politics and created a lasting animosity between the two nations that was to last until the beginning of the 20th century. Two great natural disasters occurred during this period. The first, the Great European Famine that lasted from 1314 to 1317. Between 1347 and 1353, the Black Death or bubonic plague struck. The two events combined to reduce the population by a third. It was not until late in the next century that the population of Europe recovered. Meanwhile, in 1326, the Ottoman Empire, which would remain dominant in much of the Middle East until the end of World War I, came to power, while in China, the Ming dynasty was founded in 1386.